Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our in-house guests, we would ask that last moment courtesy to check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we post today's program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference as well. Leading our discussion today is Olivia Enos. She is a policy analyst in our Asian Studies Center. She specializes in human rights and transnational criminal issues. She has published numerous papers on human trafficking in Asia, human rights in North Korea, elections in Burma and Cambodia, religious freedom in South Asia, and social issues in China, among other topics. In 2014, she co-founded the Council on Asian Affairs, a group for young Asia policy professionals here in Washington, D.C. as well. Please join me in welcoming Olivia Enos. Olivia?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. Yesterday, Larry Nasser, former doctor for the USA gymnastics team, was sentenced to between 40 and 175 years in prison for sexually assaulting nearly 160 women and girls. His actions were nothing short of despicable. The young woman who originally filed the case against him, Rachel Den Hollander, provided the final victim impact statement where she asked the following questions. How much is a little girl worth? How much is a young woman worth? While none of the women in this case, or in all of the other various sexual assault cases in the midst of the Me Too movement, are necessarily victims of trafficking, Rachel's question rings true for every single victim and survivor of human trafficking. How much is a little girl worth? How much is a young woman worth? And since labor trafficking adversely affects men and boys, how much is a little boy worth? And what about young men? The real question is, how much is an individual worth? How much are you and I worth? Human traffickers ask this question all the time, but only because they hope to exploit an individual for all that they are quote-unquote worth by demeaning them in the worst way possible. The entire premise of human trafficking is that a trafficker can profit off of the suffering of another individual, to make actual money off of a person and to put a price tag on a human life. And they make that profit to the tune of $150 billion annually. I think that human trafficking is one of the least well understood phenomenon. When most people think of human trafficking, they think of sex trafficking, and they think of someone overseas. Maybe they think of somebody who's impoverished, or they think that it requires crossing an international border or a state line. They don't think about it happening in their own backyard. But we have trafficking occurring right up the street from the Heritage Foundation, and not just in Anacostia, but on K Street and even on the streets near Congress. And it's not just sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking, bonded labor and servitude, and it's child soldiers. According to the State Department, it's, quote, the act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. It's time to turn the tables around, and it's time to demonstrate that we care about each and every individual. That those who oppose human trafficking place a high premium on the lives of every victim of human trafficking and urgently want each and every one of them to become survivors. At Heritage, I've been working on trafficking for the last 4 years, and I've been encouraged to meet so many incredible people, including Mark and Allison, who have worked on trafficking issues tirelessly. But I'll be honest, I've also been discouraged by some of the infighting over niche issues or the desire for one group to have money over the other. And that has become incredibly discouraging because it has often obstructed our ability to create meaningful change and charter a course that guarantees that victims of trafficking become survivors and put in place policies that prevent people from being victimized in the first place. Before I introduce our two incredible speakers, I wanted to highlight a couple of policy priorities that the Heritage Foundation has been working towards and a few countries to keep an eye on in 2018. First, I think that the human trafficking community needs to do a better job of defining what trafficking is so that the average person down the street can clearly identify the problem. One of the frustrating parts about working in this field is that there isn't an absolute estimate on the number of victims of trafficking, which makes it very difficult, one, to evaluate the scope of the problem, but two, to evaluate whether or not our efforts to combat trafficking are meaningfully reducing the number of victims. No number is going to be perfect, and there have been some really notable efforts in recent years to change that, but there are still concerns that the number is not clear in order for us to craft those policies. So I would suggest first that the U.S. State Department should partner with academic institutions, think tanks, and various researchers to compile a robust database on those figures and incidences of human trafficking occurring. The hope is that then it could be considered as a part of a broader tip report tier ranking reform. When you guys came in, maybe you received a paper talking about those specific reforms and the way the State Department might go about doing that. But I think encouraging that type of reform would make it so the tip report is viewed with greater objectivity and therefore has greater regard in both the international and domestic community. The second area of focus for Heritage is to focus resources on specialized law enforcement and legal and judicial training programs. There's been many empirical studies looking at the success of law enforcement efforts to combat trafficking. One example is from the International Justice Mission, where they've evaluated projects in Cebu, Philippines, where they estimated that there was a 79% decrease in the availability of minors for sex trafficking. They also did some studies in Cambodia where they found that trafficking dropped from between 15 and 30% in the early 2000s to just 8.16% between 2014 and 2015 due to the fact that they have instituted specific programs that involve law enforcement to address human trafficking. The third area of focus for Heritage is to target traffickers and their profits. Due to its dominance in the global financial system, the U.S. Treasury Department's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing tools can actually threaten traffickers' profits. And Treasury has the ability to identify those funding sources for human trafficking, track perpetrators, rescue victims, and address the primary motive driving human trafficking, which is, in fact, profit. Freezing traffickers' assets not only threatens their bottom line, but it can illuminate networks of organized criminals or terrorists. And additionally, coordination between Treasury and local law enforcement could result in the rescue of additional victims. I think this gets at the question that I initially asked: how much is a person worth? To a trafficker, they're willing to go to great lengths to profit off of exploitation. And if we threaten that profit, we aren't exactly changing the heart of the matter or the trafficker's view on the worth of an individual, but we are making it near impossible for them to profit off of another person's misery. I think that should be one of the overarching goals of the administration when it comes to implementing anti-trafficking policy. There are just a few countries that I believe will merit special attention in 2018, and I'll focus on Asia since this is my area of expertise. First, we need to focus on Burma, where doubtless many have heard that more than 650,000 Rohingya refugees have fled to Bangladesh. This type of influx of refugees into Bangladesh creates additional vulnerabilities, not just to human trafficking, but also to human smuggling. So in the year ahead, this is one area where the administration can focus. The second is that in the area of Burma, unfortunately, the administration did not list Burma for having child soldiers. The State Department released reports earlier in the year acknowledging that child soldiers are in fact in Burma, and yet they were not listed when the Trafficking in Persons report was released. They should be listed in the future. It's actual law to put this in place. And so this is another area of focus to look for in the 2018 Trafficking in Persons report. A second country of focus should be North Korea, which is one of the administration's top foreign policy priorities. But unfortunately, in spite of the fact that the missile and nuclear tests in North Korea get discussed, CARE International UK estimates that the humanitarian crisis in North Korea is the least discussed crisis in the world. This is shocking considering that this is a priority for the administration. And human trafficking can be a part of the broader discourse on humanitarian challenges in North Korea. Third and finally, a country of interest is Malaysia. While Malaysia has made substantial improvements over the last several years, it became a pawn for political interests both under the Obama administration and I would say arguably under the Trump administration as well when Malaysia was upgraded this year. This is a part of the reason why I urge that we should consider tip report tier ranking reform and seriously consider whether or not this country actually merits the upgrade that it received last year. I could mention so many other countries, and I know Allison and Mark will certainly cover those, but I just wanted to briefly draw attention to those three. Finally, I wanted to conclude with this statement. I had really high hopes that the Trump administration would make human trafficking a top human rights priority. This year, it didn't seem to be that priority, but I think there are many opportunities to change that, 2018, 2019, 2020. And I think given the amount of people who are working tirelessly in the US government and interest in the White House, this could actually become the banner issue for human rights related subjects in the Trump administration. I think it's worth getting US policy right if we have any hope of affirming the value of an individual person's worth. So I would just pose the question both to everyone in the audience and also the Trump administration, how much is a person worth? That's the question that should shape our policies going forward. So I apologize that I know that was a rather long introductory section, but I want to now turn to introducing both Mark and Allison. Let me introduce Mark first. Mark has an incredibly illustrious career, transitioning seamlessly between academia, government, and the NGO space as a thought leader on human rights, global health, human trafficking, and global institutions. If I have a career half as interesting as Mark's, I think I will be very, very content. Mark is currently the Chief Policy Officer at Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. He's also a distinguished senior scholar at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. In the realm of fighting human trafficking, I think we're all familiar with Mark from his time as the former ambassador at large directing the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons between 2007 and 2009. But he also worked in the trafficking space at Polaris Project, as well as he is currently a board member at the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking, also known as GBCAT. In academia, he also has an illustrious career at Georgetown. I won't go into all of the details on that, but one area of focus is he wrote an excellent book that I actually have been wanting to read for a very long time, hoping to read it this year, called Human Dignity and the Future of Global Institutions. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn to Allison, who has an equally illustrious career. I feel indebted to Allison because early on, she really helped me when I was first getting into the trafficking space and has continued to be a really reliable resource for me as I've continued my work. Allison works at the Helsinki Commission, and she joined in January 2012 as counsel, where she covers human trafficking, women's issues, international parental child abduction, and combating sexual exploitation of children. She previously worked as the legal counsel for Representative Chris Smith and as policy analyst in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the U.S. State Department. She has a long history of advocating in many different international contexts and previously worked at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to both Mark and Allison to hear from them. Thank you.
Well, why don't I start? It's a pleasure being back at Heritage. I actually, right after college, was an intern and listening to talks in this very room 3 decades ago, and one of the key influences on my life is Kim Holmes, a senior thinker here at Heritage, who was my boss at the State Department. Olivia is a real treasure, a young star in Washington, developing a real reputation for expertise on human trafficking and as someone who's an observer of East Asia. And so it's a special pleasure to be invited by you. And I've known Allison for a good number of years. We probably ought not to count the years, but I knew her back at the State Department. And I won't say that she is the brain behind Chris Smith, because Chris Smith has his own substantial brain and heart, but she amplifies both that brain and heart with her work, particularly on human trafficking. So I just wanted to do an overview of the field, the work of the TIP office, and some key issues today. So first of all, I just think it's worth thinking about how there are 2 kinds of human trafficking, crudely put: trafficking for sexual exploitation and trafficking for labor exploitation. And they have some similarities. They have, pools of vulnerable people that affect both. But there have been different emphases of different administrations and different TIP ambassadors on that, and it's just worth thinking about, especially as the Trump administration appoints an ambassador and makes the kind of mark that Olivia talked about in 2018 and 2019, which only began in 2017. The Bush era began with an early movement on human trafficking with a very strong emphasis on sex trafficking. So the moral, the legal issue that is driving things. And towards the end of the Bush administration, and I played a part in this, there began to be a pivot to equally look at the very large problem of labor trafficking, whether child labor, forced labor, exploitation of migrant workers, even legal guest workers in the Gulf, to look at both, importantly. The Obama era reflected ambassadors who heavily emphasized the labor trafficking side, and there was a diminished focus on sex trafficking, and to the degree that sex trafficking was looked at, it was much more that of children and not kind of denying time to the question of the very real phenomenon of adults who are sex trafficking victims. This is a very bipartisan issue. There's been a wonderful coalition which has survived increased partisanship and polarization in our political culture, and that should stand, but that's just a fact about the Obama era emphasis. I've seen signs, and I would expect a tilt back towards sex trafficking in the Trump administration. I think there's among Republicans, among some people who are in the administration, among a key member of the Trump family, namely his daughter, I think there's a focus on exploitation of young women and girls, and I would expect that kind of swing back. I think it's important just to remember the question of demand, that there's demand for cheap goods that drives labor-related trafficking, and demand is a very important part of sex trafficking, and that you should, in order to grapple with the problem, one has to really look at the question of the men who buy sex commercially from through the exploitation of women and girls. Chris Smith, as Allison's boss and mentor, it has been a champion with each of the successive reauthorizations of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 to amp up the focus on demand. Recently, Congressman Hultgren has championed legislation that would go even farther, that would say that one of the tests for where countries are ranked in the report would be, are they trying to fight the demand for sex trafficking? Have they tried to change laws so that one punishes what we call in the United States the Johns? I don't know how far the next Trafficking Victims Protection Act reauthorization will get on it, although I suspect that it probably, given some resistance to that, one finds among libertarians, liberal Democrats, and folks at the State Department, not wanting Western countries that are allies of the United States that could get Tier 1 ranking to lose that ranking. There may be obstacles to that. But I will just note that if the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is considering launching a report to look at the work on demand of countries around the world, and if the UN Office on Drugs and Crime can do a report on demand on sex trafficking, then the U.S. report, as guided by legislation, can be even stronger on that. In the field, there's a ubiquitous 3 Ps: the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the report, the UN's protocol, Palermo Protocol, which came together about the same time as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, guide the work on trafficking to prosecution of the perpetrators, protection of the victims, I like to call that the empowerment of the survivors, and prevention. Prosecution, protection, prevention. The heavy, heavy emphasis of both the U.S. law and the UN Palermo Protocol is the first P, prosecution. And there's a lot to be said for that. I think there's also, the United States has chosen recently, since me, people who have been domestic prosecutors of human trafficking for street cred. There's a very significant chance that someone who is a prosecutor is the person who will win out to be chosen to be the next TIP ambassador. I just want to say that I personally think that the policy and the moral emphasis needs to be the second P, protection of the victims. that if you have limited resources, that the first thing we need to do is to find the victims of human trafficking, give them shelter, get them physical medical care, get them therapy for the trauma they've been through, get them job training, and help them get placed in jobs, the ultimate way that people can reclaim their dignity. And we need to have an eye on that in policy. So the report has had a great deal of impact, and there are even academics who have proven it. Beth Simmons, a legal scholar at UPenn, and Judith Kelly, a dean and scholar at Duke, have found and proven by rigorous methodology that the TIP report actually gets countries to change their behavior, and in particular to enact laws to make all forms of human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, child labor, every dimension of it, illegal. But if you look beneath the surface, they find there is a place where there's a lag, and that is on actually getting countries to implement those laws. And so you'll see what I like to used to call, when I was the ambassador, and I think it's remained the case, the loop, where a country goes up in its tier ranking when it enacts a law, like Mexico did under my tenure, and then a drop down when it proves the case that usually through lack of will, but sometimes through lack of capacity, there isn't actual implementation of the law to hold people to account, to help the victims, and to act on prevention. So implementation has to be the key, not just laws getting passed to see whether the TIP report is working. I just really want to emphasize more than any other thing in my opening remarks the integrity of the report. For the rankings to actually objectively reflect how hard governments are working on fighting the problem, they can't be compromised by political or diplomatic or strategic interests. Now, they are part of a pulling and hauling at the State Department between parts of the bureaucracy. The TIP office, with experts on this, who actually hold the pen. They write the drafts of the report, they make the proposed rankings, and it's only then in tussling with the regional bureaus of the State Department and people out in embassies that the final rankings come about. Embassies feed in information, but the pen lies with the TIP office, and it has to stay that way. But there have been times where there are governments that are allies or strategic partners of the United States who have either had, on a borderline case, gotten a softer ranking than they might have, or they were on the lowest category, Tier 3, but they had sanctions waived on them, and that is, affects the integrity of the report. It used to be that on occasion the regional bureaus, instead of saying, well, we ought to be easier on those countries in the dialogue within the State Department, there were a few cases where like, oh, what the heck, throw the book at them. And those tended to be the countries like China, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, that the United States had many different criticisms of and had poor relations with and already had sanctions on them. But I myself was privy to a case where I was essentially ordered by one of the top 3 officials of the State Department to change the ranking of a Persian Gulf state when the potentate of that state ended all dialogue with the United States and all dialogue with the U.S. ambassador. We needed to use a provision that you could change a Tier 3 ranking within 90 days if there was signs that the government was moving. Well, that government didn't move very much, but had its grade changed. An official at NSC observed that the United States will probably not get much value in return for that. More recently, when it was between there being ambassadors in the Obama administration, between Lou DeBaca and Susan Coppage, 2 countries got very questionable rankings. Malaysia and Cuba both got rankings that were higher than they deserved without the strongest person in place heading the tip office in the bureaucratic fight. The irony is that Malaysia probably got an easier ranking because they wanted to keep it viable for a trans-Pacific partnership that the Trump administration has shredded. One wonders and should keep one's eyes open about potential biases and some countries being let off easy, or some countries like the Cubas, Venezuelas, and Irans, getting the criticism they deserve easily, whereas other countries that are more favorites of the president and some senior officials might not. And that's important to keep an eye on. The last thing I wanted to talk about was a group of countries that I think are very important, and there are many that Olivia has raised, and I'm sure Allison will raise. But for students of international relations, there's this term, the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They were seen as sort of these rising powers. It's sort of a weird grouping in that you had, these two illiberal governments, Russia and China, who had been powers for a long time and on the UN Security Council, and then true rising powers in the form of Brazil, India, and South Africa. But these five sort of capture a grouping of some substantial powers in the world, whether spoilers or more constructive growing powers, and they all deserve special focus. They are all countries in which it's important for the integrity of the report to be maintained. In some of their cases, like Russia, India, China, they were a good reason that a time limit was placed on the Tier 2 watch list so that countries couldn't stay in that area, in that second to last category that Chris Smith once called the parking lot. But I think we should focus on those major powers among others. These are all countries that, as substantial powers with some level of wealth, can't justify U.S. or international community foreign assistance. Getting help in dealing with their trafficking problem isn't going to come from the United States giving Brazil, Russia, India, China, or South Africa money. But they all have a significant problem, and indeed, as relatively rich countries compared to some of their neighbors, it's just interesting that some of the most vulnerable to human trafficking are disadvantaged groups, stigmatized groups in those countries. Brazil and India becoming incredibly rich, but there are people who are sort of left to be, as Kevin Bales called them, disposable people in those countries, whether they're in forced labor in Brazil or they're Dalits in India, or North Korean refugees that China treats as economic migrants and become human trafficking victims. I just say as an aside, as a connection to my own job, I work with an organization that promotes efforts to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and in particular a rather good partnership, better than the UN and pure multilateral institutions, namely the Global Fund. And the Global Fund has, I think, given some models to Senator Corker for creating a Global Fund for human trafficking. But in the case of AIDS, TB, and malaria, you have stigmatized groups, and then some, in many cases, the problem is not just in the poorest countries, but in increasingly rich countries, the most disadvantaged or stigmatized groups, whether it's the migrant in the slums of megacities in Brazil or India who gets tuberculosis, or the people who are in the sex industry, or gay males who are stigmatized. And I think something horrible is when someone is particularly vulnerable and then they're hit with a horrendous scourge, human trafficking or epidemic disease, and then they end up being blamed or treated as disposable. We should concentrate in the trafficking area on countries that seem to be increasingly rich, but they need prodding to take care of those who are the most vulnerable to trafficking.
Alice?
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm a high honor to sit next to Ambassador Lagon on the panel. I think you'll agree with me that he is the expert's expert on human trafficking and has been a resource for many years. And for every person who works on trafficking that I know, to tell you the truth. And I'm also very thankful that the Heritage Foundation is focusing on human trafficking and hosting this panel in honor of Human Trafficking Month. Has been the focus of foundations such as the Heritage Foundation on the Hill on this issue that keeps the issue alive and moving forward as a priority. Countries aren't the only ones that need prodding on human trafficking, and members have been successfully prodded to focus on this issue now for especially the last 5 years, I would say. I worked in human trafficking now for almost 10 years, mostly on the Hill. I work as an assistant to Representative Chris Smith, who is the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And that act is the one that overhauled our entire system of addressing human trafficking. It created the programs in the Health and Human Services Department to address foreign victims in the U.S. It created the offices in the Department of Justice and funded them for prosecutors to go after human traffickers. It revamped the human trafficking laws so that prosecutors could use them more easily to address modern forms of human trafficking. And it funded the State Department and the Office of Children's, Office to monitor, I'm confusing my acronyms now, JTIB office, we'll call it the JTIB office, to write the report and to provide grants to governments and NGOs in other countries that are working to fight trafficking. So we have this entire system. Department of Homeland Security is a part of it, Department of Labor is a part of it, and it has been growing and becoming more coordinated and refined and by all accounts working rather well to address trafficking in the United States and abroad. So in the last Congress, we passed more than a dozen new trafficking bills. That is unheard of for a reauthorization year, and it reflects the bipartisan, bicameral focus on trafficking in Congress. In the years I've worked on this issue, I've seen it go from being a very niche issue on which a few members worked to an issue where members are looking for how they can fight trafficking within their committees of jurisdiction. And they're coming up with great ideas. And those ideas are being supplied oftentimes by the advocates who are on the ground and looking for ways the laws are working, ways that we can refine the laws, what needs money, how are traffickers changing their strategies, and how can the U.S. law stay up to date or better yet ahead of the traffickers. So the appropriators as well have seen the importance of this issue, and we've seen increased appropriations for trafficking almost every year for the last few years. The Department of Justice budget went up, I think, $19 million in the last 2 years, and they have put it to excellent use in all sorts of areas fighting human trafficking. We saw an increase last year in the Foreign Affairs budget to fight human trafficking with the passage of Senator Corker's MC legislation that increased the authorization for foreign trafficking about $37.5 million. So we see that appropriators are focused on this issue, that NGOs are focused on this issue. They are well coordinated. They're on the Hill. They are advocating. They're directing legislation ideas in many cases. And we have the Congress now poised to reauthorize the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000. Again, it has to be reauthorized every 3 to 4 years. And we have a highly unusual situation where we have 4 reauthorizations. This has never happened before. We have the traditional one version on the House side. That's where the bill came from, Representative Smith's office. It is a holistic bill that covers House Health and Human Services to State Department and everything in between. And then we have on the Senate side 3 bills, one by Senator Cornyn, one by Senator Grassley, and one by Senator Corker. I'll do a quick rundown of what is in those bills as it reflects the, I think, the priorities and the trends to fight human trafficking. So the Smith bill is led with Representative Karen Bass, is H.R. 2200, and it's called the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. Ambassador Legon mentioned that the protection piece is a very important piece. No quibble at all with that. The NGOs thought that prevention was seeing a lack of attention, and so this year the bill has a lot of prevention aspects in it as well. bill was named after the great American abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was born in 1818, 200 years ago, and it celebrates his birth as well as his legacy as a man who fought not only slavery, but the Jim Crow laws that followed slavery. And the bill strives to be seen in that light as a continuing in the fight against modern-day slavery. One of the main things it does is that it strengthens the implementation of U.S. laws and regulations that prevent government purchases, government procurement from getting into the hands of traffickers. As you know, the U.S. purchases billions of dollars worth of goods and services every year. And we have regulations in place that are supposed to prevent those purchases from going to companies that turn a blind eye to what's happening in their supply chains, who cut corners, who put individuals who are vulnerable at risk of trafficking. But what the law does is that it ensures that procurement officers and all U.S. agencies are educated on how to apply the contract laws in the U.S. governing procurement. It also enhances and funds the Department of Labor reporting on goods made with forced or child labor. And these reports are critical because they empower not only Customs and Border Protection, but also private companies to know what goods are being made with suspect products and parts that could be made by trafficking victims, what goods are coming from companies where a lot of people are vulnerable to, countries, where a lot of people are vulnerable to trafficking, and how and whether or not we should let those goods into the United States at all. So companies can police their own supply chains, Customs and Border Protection can police what's coming into the United States, and hopefully in those ways we can start cutting down on the profits that human traffickers make from labor trafficking. The Douglass Act also has a new approach in that it ensures that taxpayer dollars spent on travel by government employees are only going to hotels that have trained their employees on how to spot trafficking and how to report it. We have many government travelers moving around the U.S. every year, and we want to offer an incentive to hotels to say, hey, you want U.S. government business? Please train your employees on what to do if they see little girls going in and out of this hotel room, or if they see a girl in a room and men circulating in and out. We have a hotline for that. Let's teach your employees to call it. It also does that with airlines. We have reports that 600 to 800,000 trafficking victims are moved every year in plain sight on trains, on flights. We have an opportunity at that point to find them, to observe them, to offer them assistance. And so the Frederick Douglass Act asks airlines, if you're going to be receiving U.S. government contracts for flights, U.S. government travelers, please make sure you're training your employees on what to look for and who to call if you see a potential trafficking situation. So that's the Frederick Douglass Act. It passed the House in July of last year, and it is currently on the Senate side being negotiated as part of a package with the 3 Senate bills. Now, the Senate bills, one by Cornyn and Senator Klobuchar, that's S. 1311, the Abolish Human Trafficking Act, is a tour de force in the fine points of the justice system fighting human trafficking. It draws on Senator Cornyn's experience with the Justice Department, and it has many ideas both that fight demand as well as fine-tune and make more efficient the prosecution of traffickers. And so both at the federal level and at the state level, which is a difficult task. His bill ensures that law enforcement has the tools and resources that it needs, from wiretap warrants to clarifications of criminal statutes, and it's going to set us a few steps forward, I think, in fighting human trafficking, especially domestically, but also internationally, as those systems are critical for prosecuting also overseas trafficking cases of U.S. citizens who abuse children overseas. Senator Grassley's bill, S. 1312, is also one that improves coordination within the Justice Department and with the Department of Homeland Security. It authorizes the Office of Victim Assistance in the Department of Homeland Security, which will help with facilitating care for survivors and survivor cooperation. With trafficking investigations, the Department of Homeland Security has really developed many effective human trafficking programs, and it's wonderful to see the Justice Department and Homeland Security working closely together. It also allows the U.S. Secret Service to assist other law enforcement on trafficking cases. So really what we're seeing in these bills is a whole of government approach to fighting human trafficking. We're seeing agencies work together, we're seeing them coordinate, and it's a wonder to behold because that wasn't necessarily the case 10 years ago, and it certainly wasn't the case 20 years ago. So it's definitely good news. Now, these three bills that I've just mentioned are highly compatible. They have almost no overlap. They have some similarities to them, but they all kind of operate in different spaces and pass easily as a package. Senator Corker introduced his Trafficking Reauthorization, which is S 1848, and then it was updated to S 1862. And this happened in September of last year. It is still in the Senate. The other two bills are now out of the Senate and over on the House side and being negotiated as part of the package. Senator Corker's bill is still in the Senate, and it has a couple holds by other senators. The bill has holds primarily on the End Modern Slavery Initiative provision. And this provision I mentioned earlier, it did increase the foreign affairs budget for human trafficking, but it did so with kind of an experimental international public-private partnership idea. And this was controversial in 2016 and 2017. It was a large amount of funding. $37.5 million is almost twice the Health and Human Services budget to fight human trafficking, and is an enormous amount of money in the trafficking world. And so it was going to a non-governmental entity. And Congress gets nervous about things like that because it's much more difficult to do oversight of a non-governmental entity. The idea is that U.S. seed money would start this fund. Other governments and individuals would add tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to this fund. The goal was to have a $1.5 billion fund. And then that money would then be coordinated and targeted to fight human trafficking in certain sectors for maximum impact. So it's kind of like let's focus on one thing and give it every dollar that we can and see if we can eradicate trafficking in a certain field. So members on both sides of the aisle actually were concerned that the proposed legislation lacked the safeguards to ensure that the money would be awarded competitively to an organization that would have the expertise, network, and staff to effectively handle $37.5 billion to $1.5 billion. That's a big task. There were concerns that NGO would not be adequately accountable to Congress. There were concerns that the board directing the money, the majority of voting seats for this board are big donor countries and individuals. There are concerns that this could be open to ideological capture. You contribute $10 million, you get a seat on the board, but who knows if you're really a trafficking expert and what your input, lacking expertise, might do with the rest of the money. There are currently 4 board members who are real experts on the board. The board has 10 seats that are still empty. There's concern that it could turn out like the Human Rights Council at the UN, where you have the council gradually taken over by the countries that are the bad actors. It makes them look good, and yet they're really not abiding by the principles of human rights, much less preventing human trafficking within their home countries. So in addition, there were concerns that the U.S.-created fund would be taken over by countries that would mingle anti-trafficking work with their efforts to push abortion on demand around the world. We've seen this scenario happen in many other funds around the world, particularly international funds, and that's of concern to pro-life members in Congress. In the end, Senator McCain brokered a deal that gave the MC experiment 5 years of funding with a sunset in 2020, and that amounted to $187.5 million in authorized funds to see if this experiment would work and be effective. Now, just 1 year after this deal was struck, Senator Corker added MC to his Trafficking Reauthorization bill. Many provisions in the Corker Reauthorization bill, MC is one of them, and that's where we're stuck right now in the package negotiation. So members are asking questions. So what has happened to the $50 million that we've already given the fund? What's happening with the grants that the fund is supposed to be distributing? What's happening with the board? We're not getting answers to any of those questions. As far as we know, the grants have not been distributed yet. The board is still 3 members. They're looking for a full-time executive director, and the State Department is not answering questions. So there's concern that it's not the right time to be extending the authorization for this entity an additional 3 years to 2023. The situation got a little bit more complicated. Senator Corker is very committed to extending the life of this fund an additional 3 years and has taken hostage at least 2 other bills until as part of the package, quote-unquote package, with the trafficking bill. Since September, he's been holding H.R. 390, a bill that would provide millions in aid to Yazidis and Christians who have been targets of genocide in Iraq. He's also holding S-905, the Syria War Crimes Accountability Act, which would allow the State Department to assist groups that are identifying and gathering evidence against war criminals in Syria. These are bills that were urgent, and they've been held since September, so that's not setting well with certain members of Congress. The House and Senate leadership support a four-bill package, so we're working on resolving the MC issue as quickly as possible, especially since the authorizations for all the other funding that we're talking about, Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, Homeland Security, all of that funding expired in September. The MC funding doesn't expire till 2020, so we are very concerned that we get the issue resolved quickly so that the other funding can continue to flow. What's coming up in Congress? Fighting demand, as Ambassador Lagon mentioned, and also Olivia mentioned, one of the most difficult issues that I've seen in my time in Congress has been how to handle the advertising of trafficking victims online, Backpage, Craigslist. This issue has been around and debated since 2010. And in the last year and a half, 2 years, we've seen members step up to the plate and dedicate the enormous amount of time and expertise to cracking this issue. The problem is that the Communications Decency Act, which was written in the mid-90s, created a special immunity clause so that websites that were platforms for third parties would not be held accountable for what those third parties put on their websites. Unfortunately, some of those platforms have exploited that issue, and they're profiting off of the facilitation of human trafficking from their websites. Backpage is one that's been under scrutiny by Congress now for I'd say, at least 5 years. They had several hearings on the Senate side, and for some reason, the Department of Justice has never prosecuted Backpage. Victims across the country have tried to launch civil suits against Backpage victims and now survivors who want damages for what happened to them on Backpage have not been able to have their day in court because of this immunity clause in the CDA. So what's happened is that Representative Wagner on the House side, Portman and Blumenthal on the Senate side, and also Representative Maloney, I believe, on the House side as well, have worked on bills that would address both of these issues. The House bill has developed a very strong criminal law component. What the bill does very effectively, in my opinion, is create a way for state prosecutors to go after the online trafficking that they see on the websites. This would unleash a strong Department of Justice. Well, the Department of Justice hasn't done it, so the state prosecutors could fill in the gap for what the Department of Justice has been unwilling or unable to do. The Senate version of the bill, SESTA, I believe, is also up. It has 66 co-sponsors, which is quite a feat on the Senate side, and it makes it easier for victims to sue websites such as Backpage for the trafficking on those websites. So those are two bills coming up. They would be incredibly effective to fight demand. Nothing is a silver bullet, but as far as demand goes, they would move us ahead strongly. The last thing I'll mention very briefly is that we're seeing more and more studies that link human trafficking to children who have been exposed to pornography at a young age. We're seeing studies that show that they are not only more vulnerable to being trafficked, studies that show especially women, young girls who are exposed to pornography at a young age online are more likely to suffer forced sex at the hands of acquaintances, but also that young men who access online pornography at a young age are committing sex assaults at a very early age. They are more likely to be prostituting themselves. And so one thing that I've heard percolating in the halls of Congress is legislation that would follow in the path of the UK, Finland, Iceland, Germany, and create age walls for those who would want to access pornography websites. It would be a way to keep children off of them, and fortunately technology has evolved to the point where age walls can be accomplished without names being exchanged. And if you're interested in that, please ask me during Q&A or afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, Mark and Allison. Allison, thank you in particular for being willing to address and outline so many of the complex issues that are passing through Congress right now. As the moderator, I'm going to ask the first question, and I'll give you guys some time to think through what questions you'd like to ask. And I wanted to ask, if you were in the president's shoes, which issue would you tackle first or make a primary theme or priority for the administration in addressing human trafficking?
Well, I mean, I've indicated that I think we need to amp up the focus on protection of victims. So I think considering resources there makes sense. When you ask skeptical questions about money going to international institutions and skeptical questions about money going to foreign aid, it's worth asking what actually deserves a little bit more money. And I think we ought to think about that. In particular, as Senator Corker has created this partnership fund, which would get more money if the authorization level were appropriated than either Health and Human Services or the very effective TIP office. It's worth thinking, is that the right proportion? Congress and activists have supported the expansion of funding for the State Department TIP office and its staff. And I'm not convinced that a larger office is necessarily a better one. But the amount of funding that it has to give to NGOs, civil society, and partners around the world to fight human trafficking and help the victims has remained fairly static. And I think that should be the priority.
And Allison?
So many ways to answer that question, but I think one of the primary ones would be to appoint the ambassador at large for human trafficking. That position has been vacant for a year, and the last time that position was vacant during report writing season, which we're in right now, the CHIP report is being compiled and worked on right now. The last time we did not have an ambassador in that season, we got our worst TIP report on record. It was a lost opportunity, and we're still seeing reverberations of the embarrassment that report was in Congress. There are a lot of provisions in the reauthorization bills addressing some of the gaps that happened in that time. So appointing the ambassador as soon as possible is key to our U.S. leadership as well as world leadership on this issue. The office, the JTIP office, is also the U.S. government convener on human trafficking. It's the office that's designated to bring together all of the other agencies that work on human trafficking. And so it has a really important domestic leadership role as well in making sure that the agencies are coordinating with each other and being as effective as possible with the money appropriated to them by Congress.
Thank you, guys. Now, when you ask a question, please tell us your name, your affiliation, and please do ask a question. I will interrupt you if you're just giving a dissertation. So.
Thanks. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. I'm a former Foreign Service officer. Mark and I actually worked with Kim Holmes together at one point. And I've had a particular interest in how to prevent appropriated funds being used overseas, which might enable trafficking. And it's pretty complicated. As you know, on the Hill, you write a bill. It's a pretty rough tool. It goes to the administration. They try to write rules and then translate that into the federal acquisition regulations and the actual clauses that go into the contracts. And they work pretty hard at trying to put some language in there which will ensure that contractors do the right thing in trying to make sure that anybody they hire overseas has not been trafficked. But the traffickers are really creative about finding ways around it, and there's a burden on contractors in trying to prevent, how far they can go to try to implement those regulations. And I was wondering if you had any views on how either Congress or the administration might refine some of those rules and regulations to try to strengthen the ability to prevent trafficking while not, putting too much of a burden, either financial or legal, on contractors to comply with those rules.
Why don't I suggest that I just say for a minute how we got to where we are now, and maybe you can offer opinions on what Will Embry of DynCorp has raised. So when I was there, and my predecessor as the ambassador, things took place in Iraq with contractors that the U.S. government was funding, and some of the other problems that one saw in the Gulf states of migrant guest workers ending up being human trafficking victims, going to different places than they thought, having their passports and papers being held. Horrendous conditions actually happened in some cases funded by U.S. contractors. And so this led to an impulse of dealing with this. Additionally, I think the Obama administration, particularly under Ambassador DeBaca, felt there's only so far you can get with other parts of the bureaucracy and some allergy to have super regulation. So a good place to start would be the U.S. government thinking about regulations related to who the U.S. government gives money to as contractors. And I think that's where we've gotten to the somewhat messy situation that Will describes.
This is a sticky wicket, as you do mention. It's an issue that Congress has tried to address multiple times in multiple reauthorizations. As I mentioned, we do these reauthorizations every 3 to 4 years, and this one I think first showed up in 2003. We've refined it again and again. We've had studies done on what's being implemented, and especially through military contracts. That's one of the primary focus areas. And in, I believe it was 2013, Senator Langford and Representative Smith led the End Trafficking and Government Contracting bill, which was added to the NDAA that year. And what it did is it listed very specifically these behaviors: holding passports, participation in commercial sex, low housing standards, just piece by piece. We said if any of these are present, then there should be reporting up the chain. And we tried to make it a situation where the contractor at the top would not be held liable for errors by subcontractors or misbehavior by subcontractors if it was reported in the appropriate way and dealt with in the appropriate way. So the goal is not gotcha. The goal is not disbarment of contractors. The goal is not to bleed them dry of resources. The goal is that contractors themselves look at their individual systems that they have in their individual circumstances and craft the policies that need to be in place for reporting and standards of conduct that will be effective in preventing human trafficking. It's difficult when you've got many, many layers of subs, and maybe that's one of the problems. Maybe we need to shorten the layer of subs, but it's something that the U.S. government can't do by itself. It has to have the participation and input from each contractor on how their particular chain works. So I'm sure that we will take another pass at it in another year or two. So any ideas you have on refining the system would be welcome.
Thank you. My name is Mariah. I work at the Heritage Foundation. So my question deals probably a little bit more on the legalities of crossing borders, either within the United States as well as internationally. What complications do we reach when I don't actually know, to be quite honest, but if states have different laws within their own local governments, aside from federal government, what kind of complications do we face? Like I said, internally, if there is a case, say Indiana to X, what complications does that have? Even though this is obviously the right thing to do, it needs to be an expedited action, and yet gets caught up in the legalities. We can just focus on the United States just to make that a little easier. So yeah, what kind of complications do we have, and how can we work to have states, communicating and interacting together in a positive manner?
Do you want to start? Or?
This is where I get to say we work at the federal level of law, and states have to work out their own issues. But we are actually working to help them navigate those issues. Senator Cornyn's bill has some sections in it that will help address some of those coordination issues. And the private sector has also stepped up to help with those issues. Some of you may have heard of Thorn, formerly the DNA Foundation, and they have a tool called the Spotlight tool. And what this tool does is that it takes a special algorithm, goes through all the daily massive number of postings on Backpage and other websites of minors being trafficked, and it looks through the gibberish and all the street language and pulls out the cases that look most likely to be trafficking cases, flags those cases for police officers. And it's been doing this so long, it has an in-depth database where it can track where that phone number has appeared in other pages on other cities and other states. And then it can also show which members of law enforcement in those other cities and other states have been tracking those cases. And so right there we have a tool that's free and that's available. Spotlight is the Thorn Foundation does trainings on this. They are eager for state and local law enforcement to be using it, and they can know which cases are already being paid attention to, by what state, who to call, and if there's another case they should be focusing on that nobody's paying attention to, they can. And this is also very critical because the minors are moved so quickly that there has to be intercity and interstate coordination to solve these cases.
Just a couple of words on this. I was head of Polaris project in 2009, 2010, and one of its focuses was the strength of the 50 states laws. In a way, I sort of went from my job being like prodding countries to make sure they had laws to making sure the U.S. 50 states had laws that kind of met the same kind of aspirations that the national law had. And I think, you know, Polaris and Shared Hope International have sort of tracked the laws and the record of those 50 states. And what's on the books has gotten to be rather good since then. But I think there are a couple of things in a good question you ask. I actually think the bigger issue is the coordination between federal law enforcement, of which there are multiple parts, the FBI only being one, state and local. And that, so even in one place, those levels of coordination need to happen. There's been some stronger task forces that have existed and included faith-based organizations like the Salvation Army in the Chicago area. And more of that, I think, is perhaps additionally important. The last thing is just on the states working together. It's a good question, but I really would emphasize what Olivia pointed out early on, which is, although human trafficking sounds like it's predominantly about movement, it is not predominantly about movement, it's about the exploitation. And so moving between states and different jurisdictions is a complication, but just as crossing borders is often part of human trafficking, it's not the essence of it.
I'm Esther Chung from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. So what are some practical ways where normal people can help and protect victims? And the legal side is also very, very important, but what are some practical ways where ordinary people who are very passionate about ending human trafficking could help?
I'll answer briefly. Having worked in the NGO world on multiple issues, including human trafficking, the most important thing that you can think of is how to answer the question, what can I do? And not only answer where you can click on something in Slacktivism and speak to your, the issue that you support, or give a donation to organizations that do good work. So, I think actually something that people ought to think about is not trying to be vigilantes or not trying to do the main job of identifying victims. If you are not sure, then turning to the national hotline that Polaris Project operates is a great way to put that into other people's hands and spot something that may look awry, but let others take it forward. I think citizens should think about pressuring their political leaders to prioritize this, and that that prosecution and money for victims are things that need emphasis. We don't need more bills, and there are tons, as Allison points out. We need ones that actually give resources to this and prioritize human trafficking as a problem vis-a-vis other crimes.
Yeah, and if I could just answer that a little bit, I think, our panel has focused a lot on federal level solutions and has focused on the role of the government in addressing human trafficking. But I think that there are a lot of ways that communities can come alongside victims of human trafficking. And sometimes it's as simple as just like loving your neighbor. Whether that neighbor is like victim of trafficking, somebody who's experienced smuggling, maybe a refugee. I think a lot of churches have the ability to connect you, with those individuals. There are a lot of wonderful organizations, especially being here in DC, who are working directly with survivors of trafficking. And so seeing if you can reach out to them. And I've had some friends who've actually served in these sort of halfway house things. I may not be using the term correctly, but where survivors will go when they're going through rehabilitation and counseling, and they've actually stayed overnight so that they could be there and serve as like a protector. That's a really practical way, and there are a number of organizations. They're not on the top of my head right now, but who are involved in that. And that would be one way to very practically just be there.
One example is Courtney's House.
Yes.
Where a survivor of human trafficking founded it, first worked at Polaris and created, and that is an example of helping the victims, particularly of sex trafficking, of many different varieties.
Jenna.
Hi, I'm Jenna Gibson. I'm with the Korea Economic Institute. So my question relates a little bit to what Olivia started off with, since my focus is on Korea and East Asia. But particularly when we're talking about China, as Olivia mentioned, there's a lot of disagreement about whether some people are trafficked or the terms that are being used. And I'm sure with labor trafficking, since that is maybe a little bit newer addition to this conversation, there might be disagreement with some of the countries that you're trying to work with to ameliorate the situation, whether they even agree on who is a victim of trafficking. So how do you navigate that, and how do you come to an agreement about the different types of trafficking or the people who are victims?
Do you want to go first?
China has been a difficult issue in that regard. China has a law that looks at people who are involved in illegal adoptions as being trafficking victims. It counts them as trafficking victims. It counts prosecutions under that as trafficking prosecutions. And under the Palermo Protocol, under U.S. standards, under international standards, illegal adoptions are obviously not legal, but unless the child is being sold to someone that is exploiting that child in slavery, in labor trafficking or sex trafficking, it's not technically human trafficking. And so the trafficking cases would be a very small subset in most countries of illegal adoptions. So China's been providing numbers that we have always taken with a grain of salt, and we're constantly encouraging them diplomatically to update their laws and to count the cases that would be recognized internationally as human trafficking cases. I think the situation with the North Korean laborers is definitely not a new situation, but it's has some nuance to it. These are workers from North Korea who are by the hundreds of thousands, in many accounts, working in China, working in Russia. 80% of their pay is going back to the North Korean regime, and which we can only assume is going into weapons. So it's a connection between security and trafficking, but it's also an issue of, are these workers human trafficking victims? They have better conditions than they'd probably have in Korea, although that's not saying much at all by any other international standards. They would be human trafficking victims. So I believe the State Department counts as human trafficking victims. On the Hill, we count them as human trafficking victims.
I can't do a lot better than that, especially on the subject of China and North Korea. There are ways in which countries count people who shouldn't be counted as human trafficking victims, and if the U.S. global report from the State Department is looking at how much they're doing, if they're pursuing a problem that isn't human trafficking, then, as it were, they shouldn't get credit for it. And there are implications for countries like China, like some Gulf countries, that sort of think of this as like a border security issue, that you need to have more secure borders. And if Gulf countries decide the problem is they've just got so many people working there as migrant workers, as opposed to seeing that since they rely on so many foreign workers, they ought to make sure that they are not subject to gross exploitation. That's a problem. The other problem that I think is attenuated is this long-standing language that has existed on child labor and forced labor. And the business community in some countries have wondered, so there's this human trafficking and there's these language that the ILO and other countries have been talking about for a while. They're the same thing, and I think we've gotten better understanding of that.
I just want to make a couple of points on that. I think that this gets back to what I was initially saying about how the definition of human trafficking isn't necessarily clear. I mean, we do have a laid out definition from the UN Palermo Protocol, and then we do have US law definition, but I think that various countries, when they're reporting to the TIP report, are not necessarily reporting actual trafficking victims, and in some cases may even be inflating, especially when they report on their global law enforcement data, the specific individuals who have been apprehended. And I think that this creates greater confusion around the trafficking space in general. But I feel like North Korea is sort of this inroad in many ways for the human rights community and also for the trafficking community, because trafficking occurs in almost all of its different forms in the North Korean case, and because the administration prioritizes North Korea so highly. I kind of wonder whether or not launching the trafficking conversation within that context might have greater appeal to this administration. So maybe all of us can sort of think through ways that this example could be used to elevate some of the human trafficking concerns that we have. We received a question from a listener online named Lauren Hughes. I think this is directed to both of you, but I think it's probably most relevant to your comments about protection, Mark. It says, what is your opinion of the Nordic model as the example for the protection aspect of the Palermo Protocol, TVPA, et cetera? Is that a model that can translate to the U.S.?
The Nordic model usually refers in large part to sex trafficking. One might say that there are three kinds of models for dealing with sex trafficking, and I'll address the protection part quickly. But there's, kind of the Dutch-German model that, the pimp or trafficker is held to account, but the person who is being sold and the buyer are not punished. And then in the United States and many other countries, there's a situation where the pimp or trafficker and the person who is being sold are criminal, and the buyer may be criminal but is often let off the hook in practice. The Nordic model suggests that you should hold the pimp or trafficker to account. You should never punish the person who is in the sex trade, irrespective of whether they're prostituted or trafficked, and that the buyer should be held to account. And I think that has proven to be an effective model that, relative to some neighboring states, that model has worked. Now, maybe it works better if you're a big social democratic kind of state like Nordic states are, and that they have substantial social services. So it sort of goes along with helping the victim. And that sort of raises questions that here under this roof we would naturally ask, is that a formula that works for everybody? And addressing the protection part of that question. I've written several times. You'll find, if you Google me, you'll find I'm an ardent supporter of the Nordic model or Swedish model over the other two.
Any other questions?
I'm Clay McDermott with the HHS. We touched on it briefly, but is there anything that the HHS or its grantees should be doing that they are currently not doing, or should do more of that they currently are doing?
Actually, I'd offer some thoughts without necessarily assessing, kind of how they've done at the, late Obama administration or early Trump administration. But making sure that faith-based organizations get a fair shake to be, get a share of resources. The notion that faith-based organizations are not disciplined, or that they are based on faith rather than empirical data, is a really unfair characterization. And so there have been many cases of faith-based organizations having great impact. Two mentioned here earlier today are just an example, whether it's Salvation Army in Chicago or International Justice Mission, which is without a doubt the single finest international NGO on human trafficking, and it's faith-based.
I think we in government have a lot to learn from the NGO communities, the people who are on the ground that are doing direct services to victims. I learned of a new organization, USIAHT, It's a long acronym, but it has pioneered an approach to sheltering victims in the U.S., minor survivors. So they've been rescued, they're out of the life, and they're teenagers, and they're trying to recover from the horrendous experiences that they've had. One problem that we've had is that the recidivism. It's very hard, especially when someone entered the life at a very young age, to go through an entire rehabilitation process. Sometimes it takes a few times in and out of the system. But what this group has pioneered are homes that, instead of separating the children from the general population, they treat them like normal teenagers. They leave the house to go to school. They engage in after-school sports. And so they're giving these teens the life that they would have had, approximating it at least, if they had not suffered the way that they had into the trafficking life. And they found that that's very effective for helping the children to decide to stay in the shelters and to go through the full rehabilitation process, which can take years. And so in government, we're constantly learning from the private sector how these programs work best. And HHS money is prime grant money that can be used to come alongside programs like that and to learn from programs like that. I know HHS has been doing a good job of coordinating with DOJ. I've seen more and more of that recently on how to help domestic victims in the U.S. There are many great ideas being formed there, and it's important for both of those agencies to be talking to each other as they are assisting some of the same populations.
I just want to add, and it's not really HHS's job, but I started out by saying that protection of the victims, re-empowerment of the survivors is like the first order thing. So I mentioned an array of steps. You need to find the victim who's often being told by her or his exploiter that you're going to be treated as stigmatized or criminal, so don't step forward. And then you need to give them shelter, and then physical medical care, psychological therapy, job training and placement. I think the end of that arc of the job training and placement is something that is underdeveloped and something that the private sector can do. And the UK has been taking some steps on legislation that has really been forward-leaning in its own Slavery Act. But now we're seeing an initiative in the UK of businesses thinking of taking a chance on former human trafficking victims. So let's just think, if someone is to reclaim their dignity, having a job and being able to have a viable economic existence, not in the realm that they were before, is essential. Otherwise, you're kind of dropping the ball on getting, people on their feet.
And I would just add that I believe that Planned Parenthood is a grant recipient for HHS. There have been some reports that Planned Parenthood, for example, has come in contact with trafficking victims and then has summarily not reported them, or which I believe healthcare providers are supposed to be mandatory reporters if they believe that they see signs of human trafficking. So there may be a need to have greater investigation into whether or not recipients of HHS grants, whether it's Planned Parenthood or any other entity, are actually reporting when they do see signs that somebody may be a victim of human trafficking. Any other questions?
Thank you. Sam Reed, I'm a graduate student in the area. You mentioned security earlier. I've read some reports that non-state actors like terrorist organizations are getting more involved in stuff like human trafficking and drug smuggling, etc., to try to finance their operations. Does that match what the three of you have seen, or would you disagree with that at all?
It's true. And the most striking case of this is ISIS, that both has cruelly victimized women and girls out of their brutality, but also to make money, to do their thing. I think there is a world of international crime in which the bad guys, the profiteers, weigh the risk of getting caught or punished versus, the profits. And there's been variation between drug trafficking and human trafficking and other crimes. But I think it's important to recognize that some things are big criminal networks. Some are connected to terrorist or violent groups. But then there are much more isolated cases that are not parts of those larger networks. And so it's important to not think the solution is to stop the movement of business and people across borders, because it's all one big criminal terrorist trafficking problem, because it is not necessarily all the same thing.
I would just echo that. That was actually one of the reasons why I brought up in my earlier remarks that it would be a good idea to think about threatening the profits to traffickers. And I think that Treasury does have certain tools, especially the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing tools that could be used, especially in the ISIS case. And so those types of tools, I mean, Treasury literally has the ability to name a particular person, and then, as they see that person's corresponding bank account, go through the New York Federal Reserve, they have the ability to freeze that transaction and then seize those assets. And I think that if you could engage in those types of activities, which are already applied to drug trafficking in a more active manner with human trafficking, I think you really could see some success in cutting off, especially the big actors. But I would reiterate what Mark said about, we shouldn't conceive of trafficking as all these like high dollar rollers, big organized crime, or big terrorist groups. Sometimes it really is just a guy down the street or a lady at a nail salon who's engaging in some of these smaller level issues that would never rise probably to the level that Treasury could get involved in. Well, if there are no other questions, would you please join me in thanking our speakers?